welcome back to another Terranscapes video. This video is part 2 of a little 3-part series. Oh my God, I did it again. I don't know what that is. On applying a bark mixture to a wire armature tree. If you have not seen part 1, you should go and check it out. But because I expect to get some comments and questions on this series, here's a brief summary of some of the key points from the intro. And if you want to pause and take a look at those, you can do that right now. So without further ado, let's jump in and take a look at part 2 and see how the progress is moving along on this tree. So as you can see now, I've done quite a bit of work adding branches to the top of the canopy, expanding some of the lower branches, adding a little bit more here, this branch, widening it out, and also widening out the top of the canopy as well. And adding a few branches up close to the top so I can nestle some crown foliage on there rather than having a single peak. So this was a little bit more work than I expected, but I was watching Jiro Dreams of Sushi recently, and if you haven't seen that movie, it's J-I-R-O, Dreams of Sushi, and he was talking about the pursuit of excellence in the work that you do. And I was actually feeling a little bit like, what am I doing with this tree? And then when I rewatched that second time, I realized that I need to not approach this tree as something that has to be done within a certain amount of time or in a certain way. I need to make it the tree that I want to see. What I plan on doing at this moment is putting on some more bark. Now, this time, what I've done is I've mixed it with almost no plaster in it. And the reason is that what I noticed with some of the ends of the branches, let's see if I can find, I've actually gone back through, I've actually taken off some of the bark mixture from the branches because they were a little globby and I don't want them to end up overly thick. So I went back in and took some of that off. All right, so last night I started doing the second coat with a thicker mix, and just before I show you any more of that, I just wanted to mention, this is Saran Wrap's Press and Seal. This is a fantastic Saran Wrap for sealing things. It makes an excellent airtight seal, and I use it on all sorts of stuff when I'm mixing up paint or anything that I want to keep, especially for, a few days. Put the press and seal on it, and it's good like the day I mixed it up. There's a pro tip, press and seal. So what I did is I took my original mixture and I added quite a bit more plaster to it. This gives you an idea of its viscosity. So it's pretty thick, but it is not at a paste stage. And just to do the last branch, I thought I would do the last branch with you here. So here is now hopefully I'll boost the contrast in post if this is not showing well. But you can see the very, clear definition. And what I've been doing is brushing it over those areas so that I brush the tops of the wires sort of clean, so I'm doing more of a fill rather than a complete another layer. Now, this is actually, what's nice about the consistency of this is that it settles, so it tends to pool, if you will. It tends to pool And so it actually will slump a little bit off of those high spots into the low spots. And it has been working very well to fill those areas. I have a kind of a crazy void right here where the trunk is kind of a little bit, and this really should be filled in so it comes in more like that, which is fine. And that means I probably will want to thicken up the base a little bit more so it's a little bit more in proportion. And there's another area. Hopefully you can see this. See if I can get it at an angle that'll show. Right in here, I have another area that really needs to be thickened as well. And so that is going to carry down a little bit down the trunk, right, as I need to taper it and make it proportional. So I may need to add more at the lower layers, and that will be filled a little bit more easily with a thicker mixture. So that last layer of bark has dried now, and I've been thinking about the tree while it's been sitting on my bench for a little bit, and I realized that I don't like exactly just how pointed it is. It's just sticking up just a little bit too much, in my opinion, because I really don't want the crown to come too much to a point. So I'm going to get radical here. I'm going to take that off. And that'll be covered up by foliage, no problem. And I'm going to push, before I do the next coat, I'm going to push all these branches up. Okay, I feel a little bit better about this. So one of the nice things about this bark mixture is it is somewhat flexible in the thinner areas. Where it is thick and you bend too much, it will crack, but that's easy to fill with the next coat. So you can still play with it while you're working on it, and then when you're done, you can bend it a little bit. So this is the bark mixture that has been sitting here for about a week, I think, covered in the press and seal there, and that stuff has really done a good job of holding this from drying out. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I want the next layer to be the last layer, and it being a little thicker will be helpful for that. I'm just seeing how not very runny. I was debating about whether to add water to it. I think I'm going to go with it just the way it is. And if I don't like it, I can stop and put water in it. But you can't take water back out. So I really would rather not thin it more than I'd like. And this may very well not cover all of the remaining ridges. And I've decided that that's okay. because, you know what, after I get done with this segment, I gotta glue this back in. It's come a little loose. And since this tree isn't really following a super realistic shape, and if I'm going to play it I get a little leeway, being fantasy and all, this will be going into a more fantasy themed display that I should not worry about it and let that texture, those ridges remain, just to kind of give the tree a little character. Now, one thought while I work on this layer is that I probably started with a mixture that's maybe a little too thin. I would think 2 coats would be the goal to aim for. One thing I noticed, though, is that the blending, the smoothing, I should say, feathering, if you will, of the edges of the new material and the previous material is not always that easy, actually. It's something to consider. It's certainly a lot easier to feather thinner material as well as material that doesn't set up too quickly. And of course, as it gets thicker, right, it has less moisture, so it's going to set up faster. And so, but you can see it becomes this sort of, I don't know, balancing act. At least it feels that way to me, of get things covered fast enough that everybody kind of smooths out together, everybody being all the different branches, the bark on them. And at the same time, go back to areas where it's starting to set up and it will hold texture. Because as you can see right now, right, this is glossy and round. This material is still not, too stiff that it won't settle on its own. So there's a bit of a, time issue. It's kind of like cooking your eggs, although I don't eat eggs anymore. Right? You want a sunny side up egg. Can't cook it too long, or the yolk will be dry. And if you don't cook it long enough, you have runny whites, unless that's something you like. I don't know. When you stop eating eggs, I don't want to proselytize, but I'll just say, when you stop eating eggs, man, eggs smell very different to you. Not great when they're cooking. So that gives you an idea of how that process is going. Picking up the branches that have a lot of wire showing. I think this is going to actually add even more girth to the branches, which was, not my original goal. And I think that says something about taking note that your armature is not the final diameter of the branches, right? The branches are going to get thicker when you apply the bark. So you can err a little bit on the side of thinner. And if you still feel like they look too thin at the end, then you can bulk it up. And in fact, as I mentioned, I think in some earlier segments, probably when I was working on when I was actually building the armature, about saying like, well, I could thicken this later. And that's true. And this is one of the ways you could thicken it without adding wire. And I think in hindsight, this would have been preferable to me than adding wire, because as I mentioned, when I was discussing the base of the tree, when I was creating the roots and the flange where it meets the soil, I was saying that, once you put the wire on, you can't take it off. And that is true at all stages of the tree. You can see here how it's losing its gloss as it starts to set up. And so I thought that maybe I'm going to need a different tool to get that bark texture. But this is a good point to just play with that just a little bit and see, so I can think about timing it when I get to the lower trunk, have an idea of what technique I might use and how set up it needs to be. I don't know if I'm liking this. Oh, maybe though. All right, I think that might work, and it's certainly going to be a little easier in a thicker area of the trunk, as well as a more proportionate graining for the size of the branch, because obviously it's a little texture heavy for such a small branch up top. Well, maybe not. That gives you a little look at what teasing it at this stage with a toothpick looks like. I've also considered, and actually Mr. Gravitt mentions that, you can go at it afterwards when it's all set up with things like a wire brush, or, he gives several ideas, but doesn't flesh them all out necessarily. So now that I've reached the bottom sections of the tree, I am working to sort of bulk up some of the areas that are a little too thin as the trunk descends. There were some narrow spots that look a little out of proportion. The tree really shouldn't look heavier above than it does below. And what I've been doing is just adding in some pretty heavy-duty globs of the bark mixture. And the bark mixture at this point, now I actually set the tree aside work-wise for a little bit, do some video editing. So I actually have sat away from this tree for several days. The mixture now is thickened a little bit, but again, it's pretty remarkable how well it has held up. Again, that press and seal wrap really does a nice job of keeping things from drying out. So I've been just kind of gooping it in some areas to just really thicken them up a lot faster. What I've noticed is that it still wants to settle smooth quite a bit. What I also have been playing with a little bit is using a little bit of water on my brush, and then I've actually been able to blend the edges really quite well. That has made a big difference in keeping those ridge lines from where new material has been placed over old material from really showing a dominant transition line. It's still present in some areas where I haven't maybe smoothed it enough. It's a little hard to tell. Sometimes, but it also occurs to me that I can hide much of that, and will, when I apply the final textural layer. And I have decided, after playing with this material for a little while now, that I really won't be able to just use this final layer as, and then texture it as I'm working on it. It's got a low enough viscosity that it continues to try to self-level, and that makes adding sort of pronounced texture to it impossible, really. And then I'm going to be trying to work over sections as they dry and try to judge that moment when it will hold the texture and everything. So that's just a pretty preposterous idea, so I'm not going to be doing that. One thing that I've also been working on, well, a little bit, is the recess that I wanted to make as a little hole in the trunk there. And you can see how hopefully the lighting will pick this up. The glossiness probably will help. But there's a little ridge line there where the old material hasn't quite smoothed. I'm going to play with that with my water a little bit here. And I'm going to smooth that out. Now, I wanted this spot actually to be a little bit, slightly larger hole, and it's just hasn't quite worked out that way, and that's okay. One of the things that trees do when they have a wound is they form I don't know if it's officially called a callus, I think it might be, but it starts to grow bark over the wound, so you end up actually with a little rounding of the bark into the void. And so I had originally thought about trying to make the void look like it had a little bit of a jagged edge. Now you can see how I've smoothed that now. See that? A little bit of water on the brush. And I've decided to just not really focus on that too much because this would be a believable outcome for a wound. And this is obviously going to be a very old wound. Most likely a branch fell off at some point and it's been healing for a while. So that is going to be just fine. Focusing my attention on the bark. And really at this stage, I've declared this tree a learning tree. And so I've really been trying to observe how the bark material has been changing as its thickness increases and how it has been drying and also trying to fix some of those areas in the trunk that looked to me particularly bad. And so that's a lot of stuff to keep an eye on, so it's easy to miss something somewhere else. Yeah, boy, this armature though, it's really made this job a lot harder. There's just still so many ridges where you can, essentially, if you know what's going on with the tree, you can see that underlying wire architecture. So that wraps up part 2 of this process. Many things have been learned, many things yet to learn. So you're going to want to hopefully stick around for part 3 and see some of that learning. Because one of my goals with this video is to show you how I learn and to also give you improvements on what I have been doing along the way. So I hope you've been finding that informative. And of course, I should always remind you that questions and comments are always welcome down below. I've been doing better on the comments, keeping up. Been putting some together for the next Cocktails and Comments video. And I hope you come back for part 3 in this series because you know that I will be back soon with another Terranscapes video.